Thank you. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. It's quite strange being in the studio and seeing you all on Zoom and not for real, but hey, we're here, so that's great. I'm thrilled that we can go ahead with these arts, philosophy and science talks. They were due to start the week of lockdown. We had our first one programmed in that week. Hi, Anne. So we had a whole summer's worth of talks booked in, and of course we had to postpone the lot, so I was absolutely gutted. So this is the first talk of the programme, and I'm absolutely thrilled that we can start with a bang with Glyn. Glyn has been researching the authenticity of Duchamp's Urinal for 35 years. So we're asking the question, if Duchamp didn't do it, who did? And so Glyn is going to send us through a whole load of slides to explain this phenomenon. And it's possibly of historical magnitude, I think, as well. And I'm going to ask him why he's been doing it. So who did it? And behind me, I'm very excited to say we have one of only two surviving urinals. I'm very excited about this. And we're going to hear all about that as well. Hello, Gary and Debbie. Brilliant. I think we're all here. So if I can ask you to please remain on mute. And what we're going to do is Glyn's going to show some slides. We're going to put a slideshow up. And then after that, if you can put some questions, any questions that you have in the chat, please. I'll be monitoring that over there off screen. And then after the slides, we'll have a question and answer and discussion. And we'll aim to finish at 10. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Glyn Thompson.
Oh, good evening, everybody. We've lost our image over here.
Okay.
Can they hear me yet?
Yes.
You can hear me. Well, I'm not going to ask the question, I'm going to answer it, but who else? Okay. As a consequence of carrying out due diligence on the attribution of much urinal to Marcel Duchamp, we might get some images up shortly, it became patently obvious that that attribution was completely unfounded. There's no evidence that even suggests that he was anything to do with the submission of much urinal to the exhibition that was held at the Grand Central Palace in Manhattan from the April the 10th to May the 5th in 1917. No evidence whatsoever. That means that having established that this was discredited, entirely discredited, it was incumbent upon someone like me who does art history to therefore try and ascertain an alternative, more credible candidate, because otherwise the status quo would remain. So that was what I proceeded to do, and I discovered that in fact the only credible candidate was Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, which I assume that everyone can see. Can you all see the first image? Yeah?
Just hang on one moment. Jess, can we put the slideshow up?
Can you put the slideshow up?
There we go.
No, that's number 2. Can you go back to number 1? That's it. So here you see the two protagonists in this story. Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven on the left, with vaporizing Marcel Duchamp underneath her with her death stare. That's her death mask from 1927. And on the right is a multiple portrait of Elsa, made as an etching in 1921 by George Biddle, who was a Philadelphia-based artist, who was in the milieu that we're talking about, who must have done those drawings while Elsa was in Philadelphia in 1917, when the urinal was actually sent from Philadelphia. So, but the attribution, therefore, was in a sense perpetuated by the assumption that Duchamp had been responsible for it when he hadn't, which means that the wrong question was being asked. The question, therefore, which should not have been asked, because it was predicated on the assumption that Duchamp had done it, was that what was the make and model of the urinal that Duchamp had submitted to the Independence? Once you have established that that's not the case, then the question had to be, what was the make and model of urinal that was submitted to the Independents? So can we go on to the next one? And through a process of orthodox art historical inquiry, I established that that urinal was in fact the identity of that urinal. So here is visual evidence of the event itself. On the top left, you've got a photograph by Alfred Stieglitz, which becomes the iconic image, which was taken on the 14th of April 1917. It was taken to this Studio 291, the Gallery 291, but it wasn't ever put on display. That image does not enter into the public domain until 1989. And this demonstrates a really important point, that the attribution to Duchamp was fabricated in both senses, in complete absence, ignorance of and then denial of the evidence that contradicted it. So there you have the only print of the plate Stieglitz exposed on the 14th of April that didn't appear in public until 1989. What did is, bottom right, a cropped version that appeared in a small avant-garde rag, very low production, that Duchamp and his friends were concerned with, where a cropped version that squared it down appears as an illustration in an attempt to develop, if you like, interest in the event itself. And that wasn't published until May the 5th, 1917. And that's the image that enters into the master narrative and is first produced again in 1932 in Cahiers d'Art, when someone called Georges Hunier, for the first time, attributes the urinal to Duchamp. And he repeats that, he takes that information from the magazine called Blind Man #2. And the image tells you very little. It is not, for instance, possible until 1989 to know what was written on the label, which is incredibly important. A label that's hanging off the tab on the left-hand side that you can just see in the Stieglitz photograph. Beneath the Stieglitz photograph is what's called a roughing-in diagram, which reminds you that the pose that Stieglitz has chosen is the only one possible. It's the flat back. The roughing-in diagram was issued with all examples of urinals by the manufacturers with the measurements of that specific example, for the plumber to know how much spoke wall space to allow for the installation. Top right are two other photographs of the urinal that have been largely overlooked and again didn't enter the public domain until the 1970s, which were taken by someone called Pierre-Henri Rocher, who was very close with Duchamp, and they were the three people who were involved in getting the photograph taken. And Rocher based apparently Jules Jim on the ménage à trois, or maybe the ménage à 69, between Beatrice Wood, Rocher and Duchamp. And on the right, you can see an enlargement of that. That is the same urinal photographed from two different points of view, and you can see why it disappeared. Because it's been hung from the underside of the lintel in the alcove in Duchamp's studio at 33 West 67th Street in New York. And that is not what you do with a urinal that's 30 pounds in weight, because the bolt hole that the suspensor has gone through into the bracket is not built to hold up 30 pounds of urinal, and it would have snapped, it's quite obvious. Wow. So the urinal completely disappeared under those circumstances. Could we have the next image, please? So, I therefore decided that in order to try and identify the make and model of the urinal, because that has to be the starting point, what is it we're dealing with? I then went through an normal process of art historical research and informed myself as fully as possible as to the history of the sanitary fixtures industry, because what was made possible anything, yeah? So there you see, on the top left, is the urinal in my possession, which I acquired in 22 years ago, and the bottom is the Stieglitz photograph of much urinal. And you can see when they're printed to scale that one is bigger than the other, right? The one above is a #1, the one below is a #3 of 3 sizes that the Bedfordshire urinal was made in. And on the right is the most critical image you'll see tonight, which is the page from Catalogue N of 1915 of the Trenton Potteries Company, which is the only image you'll find in a manufacturer's catalogue because they made it. And it shows you what's called a cut which is an idealized icon of the design, and underneath you have the three sizes. Underneath that is the corner version, and the critical statement on the right of the corner version tells you that a certain feature that you can't see fully on the images on the left is actually in that model. So what you can see there is the page in the catalogue that represents the manufacture of that model of urinal only between the years of 1915 and 1920. So it's a very specific time frame, and it gives you the specific measurements, which is absolutely critical because they are absolutely unique to that particular model at that particular time and are not repeated. Therefore, once you know what it is from that information, then it can be mistaken for nothing else. And the other feature that you will see images of shortly, that you partly see there, you can actually see in the center of the image at the bottom right, which is the corner version, is the combination of what's called the perforated ventilator and the integral strainer, which together say this is that model and can be mistaken for nothing else. Okay, so could you go to the next one, please? And here you see on the left the first example I found in 1916, and I found it in the Magic Chef Mansion in St. Louis. Okay. And on the right, you can see that feature I described, and the three at the bottom show you an image from the catalogue of what that combination of perforated ventilator and integral strainer should look like. In the middle is that from my urinal, and on the right is that from the urinal on the left, which was actually made in 1908. I don't explain the discrepancy there. Above that shows me that there was a fault occurred in that's from Mutt's urinal, okay? And it suffered a fault that made it useless to a plumber. It distorted that feature. So the Stieglitz photograph and the Rocher photographs show the same fault from two different positions, and that allows you to pinpoint absolutely, and therefore work out why Elsa might have got it cheap, because of no use to a plumber. So can we go to the next one, in that case? So that is the key evidence that says it can only be that. Now, what that tells us that it was a Bedfordshire urinal, okay, which is the basic bog standard urinal that was first developed in Britain and then imported into America, and first made in America from 1873. Okay, the basic urinal that was put into all those places where working men pissed in public. That's what the urinal was for, the war urinal. Okay, so which means that Duchamp's claim is shot, because in 1966, one of the planks of the attribution of Duchamp is a statement he made in 1966, someone called Otto Hahn, where Hahn asked him, "Why did you write Mutt on the urinal?" And Duchamp said, "Mutt comes from Mott. Mott works is where I got it from." Now, the only presence that the J.L. Mott Ironworks maintained in Manhattan, where the event is, right, was on Fifth Avenue, like 118 to 125th Avenue and 17th Street, where they had a large set of showrooms. 11-story building, whole block, 7 floors open, showrooms. So first of all, he says he got the urinal from Mott's, but he couldn't have done because it was made by the Trenton Potteries Company. And the Trenton Potteries Company, it was in their catalogue. Therefore, it wasn't in the Mott catalogue. What was in the Mott catalogue was 7 urinals, and that wasn't one of them. Okay? And Mott's from 1908 put in all their publications, everything we sell, we make. And Mott's therefore were not factoring, sourcing urinals from any other manufacturer. And of course, if it's showrooms, there are no retail sales. It's display. So those factors alone completely destroy the attribution of Duchamp. So, having gone through that process, it became quite clear that the only credible alternative was Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven. And here you see 2 of the objects she made that, in a sense, contextualize writing art on a urinal and sending it to an art exhibition. So on the left is a ring, an iron ring, that she found in the gutter on her way to marry the Baron. She was in New York in 1913, and she met Baron von Freytag-Loringhoven, who was one of the kind of men she liked. She married 3 very weak individuals because she was a very assertive woman, and so on. And she called this enduring ornament, and it's her wedding ring. The object on the left, okay, it's an iron ring. On the right is an object that is a plumbing trap, and she found this in Philadelphia and called it God, named it God, right? And it was only attributed specifically to Elsa in the 1990s because it was Morton Shambo who took the photograph. So we know that happened in Philadelphia in the year that Elsa was there, okay? So that's what she does. One of her strategies, if not aesthetic strategies, is to title everyday objects and usually make a very violent and aggressive gesture with them, okay? In fact, what we're looking at is a very rare object because there is only one example of it left, and it's that one, and it's in the Philadelphia Museum. And it's actually a Bennett anti-siphon globe trap, and it was a specific design that was only made between 1883 and 1913, right? And the one she picked up, which is that one, must have been at least 27 years old when she found it, and I'll go into that later. So here you have Elsa finding aesthetic value in everyday objects and giving them titles which invest some meaning into them, and that's the critical thing. So I have therefore suggest that, I mean, one of the obvious decisions you come to is that this is the kind of thing she does, okay? So why therefore do we look to Elsa as the likely candidate? Can we go to the next one? And there are 3 items of evidence that tells us that points us towards Elsa. They were all produced on the 11th of April 1917, and Duchamp produced one of them, and 2 reviews, well, they're not reviews, they're actually notices of Duchamp's resignation, were published in the Herald of the Sun on the same day, the 11th of April, 2 days after the Urinal had been rejected. Duchamp was not there when it was rejected. He was hanging the show. He had Easter Saturday and Easter Sunday, and a bit of Easter Monday, to hang 2,150 works of art on 2 miles of panelling, and they couldn't get into the building until the Good Friday, which is the 6th, which ironically is called Car Friday, which is interesting. Okay, so Duchamp was hanging the show, and he wasn't there when the Urinal was rejected, okay? But he wrote to his sister about it on the 11th, and miraculously the letter has been preserved, although again, it didn't enter the public domain until 1982, okay? So nobody knew the content of this letter until then, and Duchamp never talked about it. This is what you're looking at the moment, getting ahead of ourselves. The building, the bottom 2 images are of the Lincoln Arcade building, where Duchamp and Elsa both lived not together, between the 1st of January 1916 and October when Duchamp left. She was already there when he came, and she stayed on when he left. And what you see on the right is an article trying to create the idea that there's a bohemia that is not from Washington Square in that building. It was a mixed-use building which had apartments in, commercial on the ground floor and so on. And that's the entrance called Lowe's Theatre. And that's where Elsa was living at the time this event occurred in 1917, okay? So Duchamp had lived in that building until the previous, October. So, in fact, the day that Duchamp wrote to his sister in October 1916 to ask her a question, he had just formulated the concept of the ready-made, and he was probably in that building when Louis Rouillet actually drew the illustration, which is rather lovely, isn't it? And it appeared in the New York Times in the October of 2016. So Duchamp writes a letter to his sister, not from that building, but from 33 West 67th Street that he'd moved up to in October 1916. And he opens the letter. It's a chatty letter to the family back home. keeping him up to date with what he's up to, and he's not up to very much. He opens the letter with the phrase impossible d'écrire, which literally means it's impossible to write. But then he proceeds to write. So it doesn't mean that. It actually means I'm writing home about nothing much to write home about. And he writes this sentence in it that says, the Independents have opened with great success. A female friend of mine under a male pseudonym, Richard Mutt, has sent in a porcelain urinal as a sculpture. It's been rejected. I don't know why. There's nothing offensive about it. So he tells us a number of things in this letter, the contents of which are never known until 1982. All right? First of all, female friend. He must have known who it was to be able to say it's a female friend. He says male pseudonym, Richard Mutt. He's the only person to leave a record that he thought he knew it was a pseudonym. Therefore, there was no Richard Mutt. Everybody thought Richard Mutt was a flesh and blood nobody. Nobody questioned Richard Mutt's identity. Nobody suggested that Duchamp had anything to do with it. There was just no evidence, okay? And he uses the word envoyé to say his female friend sent the urinal. Now, envoyé is a term that merely describes sending something, okay? It is not the verb you would use for submitted, i.e. go through the whole process of fulfilling all the bureaucratic obligations that you have to do to join an exhibiting society and therefore have the right to show. That's very important, because he didn't say enregistré, and he didn't say soumettre, he said envoyé, and it comes back into this debate later on. So he says she sent it. That has been mistranslated as she sent it to me by people in order to give Duchamp a continuing role in the activity, but he didn't say that. He just said elle avait envoyé, not elle m'a envoyé. And the fourth important point is when he describes it to a sister to whom he has explained what a ready-made was a year before, by describing it as a sculpture, he's saying it's not a ready-made. Okay. All this is very important. So why does, very important. So why does she fit the frame? Okay. Why her and nobody else? Well, as I've said, it's typical of her practice, her aesthetic, form, style, purpose, very aggressive interventions with everyday objects. She's the only female friend of Duchamp who is in Philadelphia. Why do we think he's in Philadelphia? Because two notices published on the 11th, written by Gustave Courbet and Henry McBride, say that Richard Mutt came from Philadelphia, and that's where the urinal came from. How would they know? Because if they had been, as the critics were, hanging about, because there was the press day on the Monday the 9th when it came, they would have witnessed a crate with a waybill on it that says it came from Philadelphia. You know, it came on the train from Philadelphia, right? It would be very easy. And of course, there's another side to it I'll go back to, where Henry McBride, who was one of the leading critics on The Sun, knew a great deal about the sanitary fixtures industry, for reasons I'll tell you, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. So, what we have, therefore, is you put those two things together, these three documents, where you have information that Richard Mutt was from Philadelphia, and the urinal was sent from the Quaker City. It was made by a well-known manufacturer in Philadelphia, and it was called Fountain, but it wasn't described as a urinal, with the fact that Duchamp's only female friend, who was possibly capable of doing this thing, was in Philadelphia at the time. So why was she in Philadelphia? Why would she leave New York to go to Philadelphia in the spring of 1917? She was getting by, making a living, three ways. She was modelling for artists from both the establishment side that came up through the National Academy and from the avant-garde side that came together as the Society of Independent Artists in 1916. That's one way she made a living, and she's a very well sought after model, okay? But she complained, as I'll say later on, I'll point out later on, that her work, she wasn't taken seriously as an artist. And she made her living in two other ways. So she got by on what she did modelling, it would seem, but she was virtually only out of the gutter most of her life. The other way was shoplifting. One of the other methods was shoplifting, and she was always being banged up for shoplifting. And the other method was what the police considered to be sex work, because she behaved in such a way in public to make people think that she was a prostitute. In fact, she was. She acted like a prostitute. She demanded sex from people, and she demanded money afterwards. So we've got a very interesting character here. So that's how she makes her living. The reason why she left is this, and I discovered this from newspaper articles that nobody seemed to bother to read. On the top left, you can see a drugstore on the corner of 110th Street and Broadway. And she was arrested in the subway station, having come out of there on the 5th of January 1917, having stolen a bottle of olive oil and a box of chocolates. She was held over at the local police station and was being taken to the Harlem court the following day to be arraigned. And on top right, you can see a paddy wagon, a typical paddy wagon at the time. And the driver stopped off at the Morrisiana court on the way to Harlem. And we have two versions of what happens next from the New York newspapers. In one, she just wanders off when the driver stops to fiddle with the traces of the horse at the Morrisiana court. The other one has her hijacking the paddy wagon, driving down to the Lincoln Arcade building, rushing in, taking only one thing with her, which is Pinky her Pekingese, and as she disappears out of the back door, the Keystone Cops come in the front door. Now, I say paddy wagon, that isn't offensive to the Irish, it comes from PD for police department. Although most of the occupants of paddy wagon were Irish, and most of the people who put them there were, okay. But here we are back at the Lincoln Arcade building she stopped off at on the 6th of January, after which she completely disappeared. Okay, now we know this because on the 27th of January, there was the final session of a divorce proceeding in which Duchamp gave evidence for the plaintiff against Elsa, who was co-respondent. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why she might have had a reason for taking a swipe at Duchamp at a later date, because he was giving witness against her. She had an affair with a painter who also had a studio in the Lincoln Arcade building, and the wife sued for divorce. Now, one of the great ironies of this, that you'll see it in a minute, is that, I'm sorry, it's disappeared, it doesn't matter, is that on the 27th of January, when she was in Philadelphia, she could have read the review of that last session on the 26th, naming her, talking about her, the attendance she didn't make. And in that, Duchamp is cited as a witness, Mr. Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, right? Stenographers had problems with foreign languages, obviously. So Elsa leaves, and the most sensible thing for her to do, in order to avoid the APB that's been put out on her, they won't call that in 1936, is to cross the state line. And the quickest way to go to the next one, the quickest way to cross the state line on the left is to go down to the Pennsylvania Railroad station, you see there bottom left, and take the next train, which would have come within the hour. It would get her to New Jersey through the tunnels in about 5 minutes, and she's across the state line and home free, because she's now beyond the reach of the New York Police Department and the penal and the code. Section 1141 of the Penal Code, 1146, was actually about, we see a comment here, was about public obscenity.
I had no idea she was such a bad girl.
Yeah, terribly bad girl. So she was up for, because she was a repeat offender, 12 months and $1,000 fine. And she wouldn't have been able to afford the $300 that would have been the bail for that offence that she had made. On the right, interestingly, I've just thrown this in here, is another map of Manhattan, and that shows the restricted areas that were imposed close to industrial complexes to do with war production that were vulnerable to attack by German spies. And those are areas that you couldn't pass through if you were a non-naturalized German. So she had to stay out of Manhattan for 12 months. And I'm thinking that 12 months meant that the case had lapsed and she could come back, because she does come back. If it's not fulfilled, if it's not carried through, she isn't convicted, then I don't know, but it's odd that she comes back 12 months later. So she could have been picked up and banged up. She stays out of New York for the next 12 months, okay? So that's really why she left Philadelphia. If you go on to the next one. So the police stake out her apartment. This is in the final reviews of the court proceedings of the divorce on the 27th. It is stated that she has disappeared. They've staked out the apartment. She hasn't been seen for 3 weeks. And they carried on doing that, and she never turned up. So she's gone somewhere. And it's quite obvious she must have gone to Philadelphia at that point, right? Because George Biddle records her there in March when she comes to him to do some modelling and so on. So here you see very interesting images, which is on the left, you've got the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is the 1st of April, and it is announcing that America will be declaring war on Germany pretty soon, probably on the 2nd. So that's a Sunday. And what you can see is a photograph of, interestingly, Independence Square in Philadelphia on Saturday, the day before the 1st of April, 1917, which records basically the imminent declaration of war. And on the right, on page 5, right, is an article that says there is going to be an exhibition opening in New York next Tuesday by the Independents. And this is the first information that I can find that was published in Philadelphia that says there is going to be this exhibition. What happened was the society sent out announcements on the 20th of January after Elsa had left, saying, inviting people to join the society. She would never have seen any of those. So she wouldn't have known when she decides to send something to this exhibition, sometime in that first week, having read about it on the 1st, in the same newspaper, that it would have been necessary to belong. Because the reason why the Urinal was rejected, whatever you read about it, and all you read, the various versions you read about it, are predicated on the assumption that Duchamp had submitted it, which he hadn't. The bottom line is, if you weren't a member, you couldn't show it. What is the point of an exhibiting society that you have to join and pay money for if other people don't have to do that? You're not going to have one. So that's the bottom line, all right? And everyone's missed that. All Duchamp scholars have missed that. You will read that Duchamp sent the Urinal in order to expose the hypocrisy of the society for breaking its rule that it would show anything by anybody. They never had a rule that they'd show anybody by anything by anybody. They had a rule that said the 2 works that each member submitted would be shown without the jury interfering with it. That's the no jury rule. So everybody's got that wrong. That gives you how could Duchamp know that the society he helped found was hypocritical before they demonstrated any hypocrisy? It's bollocks, okay?
So just go over that, just to clarify that part,
okay.
That's really, really crucial.
This is really, really crucial, yeah. You will read in the normal accounts of this, of the master narrative, that the reason why Duchamp sent the Urinal in was to provoke the society to reject it, so he would expose their hypocrisy in saying anybody could show anything. But they've never said anybody could show anything. They've merely guaranteed for the members that the 2 works they sent in would be hung. And the rule is that if you're not a member, you don't get shown.
So Elsa wasn't a member?
Sorry?
Elsa wasn't a member?
And Elsa wasn't a member.
So
and Mutt wasn't a member. If you go through the catalogue, there's no evidence of them, right? It's not there. Mr. Mutt hadn't... It came on the 9th of January, far too late, April, and so on. So Elsa would not have known that sending it, in a sense, would be pointless. But I'm certain that she hoped they would exhibit it, because if they did, they'd be in a lot of trouble, and we'll come back to that. It has to do with public offence, okay? So, those are very interesting, it seems to me. So the question is, therefore, why send a Urinal to this exhibition, and why send it Mutt? Well, the main impetus of her aesthetic expression, whether it's poetry, which she was quite famous for in 1919-2021, published by the Literary Review, A lot of that poetry is produced in response to rejection. Rejection is the kind of theme, okay? And of course, she had been rejected as an artist by the independents, the avant-garde. She was part of the avant-garde, but not considered serious an artist. And of course, she was merely treated as a model by the establishment and so on. And they coalesce into the SIA, as I've said before. So if you go on to the next one, here we then have an extraordinary pair, which is right, we've got those. Philadelphia Choir, 27th of January, on the right. 27th of January, there she is, 27th of January, sitting at a cafe table, and she reads about her own divorce, her appearance in the divorce case. On the left, no, that's on the left. The other one, the 6th of February, that's the one on the right, sorry. The one on the left was the 27th. On the right is the 6th of February, where she read an interview with her father-in-law, the Baron, in Germany. It must have been an extraordinary experience, quite extraordinary experience. So, she could read all about her divorce proceedings in the newspaper in Philadelphia at the time. So the divorce case is quite important because in that, Duchamp acts, bears witness against her. So if you go on to the next one, this is what I think is the discourse that Elsa inscribed in the Urinal by writing Armatonet, which is not a name.
Jess, can we go on to the next slide?
The next one.
Thank you.
Okay. So we hear Elsa, I'm saying, sending a Urinal in reaction, basically, to a confluence of two spring offensives. The declaration of war by Germany, by America on Germany on the 6th, on Good Friday, and the opening of the exhibition of the independence on the following Tuesday. They become because, of course, as soon as America declares war, Elsa is an enemy alien, and Duchamp is an enemy alien to her because he is with the Allies, isn't he? America is with the Allies. So you've got this biographical dimension to this, as well as this, the way in which I think it's pretty obvious that the society became a representative of the American establishment that she loathed, and she wants to take a crack at it. Okay? So sometime in that week, she procured a Urinal. And that would have been quite easy to do because there were plenty of German plumbers that she could talk to in her own language. And because the Urinal was actually no use to a plumber, it would have been sitting in a corner. It hadn't been noticed that when it was delivered, because the apprentices caught the eye of the boss's daughter who's doing the book starting down. Plenty of reasons. If you didn't unpack your deliveries within 12 days and find some fault and then claim it, you wouldn't be able to claim. And of course, Urinal's very cheap, you wouldn't even waste the time. So I'm suggesting that, see, during the war, because of all sorts of reasons, there are lots of faults in sanitary fiction production. And we know that lots that occurred, there's evidence that occurred. So she could have got it quite cheaply. And of course, she could probably have spoken to the plumber in the local dialect of their grandparents, possibly, because she was brought up in Germany and so on. So I think, really, that what she was doing was sending the Urinal in order to actually destroy the society. Because to exhibit a Urinal, the Urinal is not identified as such in any of the reviews, you see. Nobody said it's Urinal. It was alternatively, well, there weren't the reviews of the exhibition, as I said. It was a figurative painting of a dirty towel. It was a figurative painting of a nude getting into a papier-mâché bath, And two said it was a piece of bathroom furniture, but that could have been anything from a toilet roll holder to a bidet. So no one says it's Urinal, because to do so would violate section 1161 to 1146 of the indecency law, public indecency.
Right.
You couldn't put an Urinal on show. I'll come to that later on. So I think Elsa was attacking the independence in order to destroy it. And it's very interesting that that is kind of mentioned as one of the reasons why people voted against exhibiting the Urinal. So in a sense, what does it mean? All right. Now, we begin with, in order to tease out possibly why there is armat on a Urinal. In December the 5th, on December the 5th, 1917, the New York Times printed an interview with Elsa as a very famous model that was working for the Art Students League and all the important people, as well as the avant-garde. She was very well thought of as a model, very good thought of. And so they interviewed her, and she said, well, I've been abandoned by my husband. I used to live in great luxuries, bullshit, right? And now I've discovered the joy of earning my own living. It's all this sort of flannel. And she says, the trouble is, I produce lots of art and nobody exhibits it, and I don't suppose they ever will, and they didn't, right? They just treat me as a model, and so on. She said, so that is why I've gone now to the German Consul General to ask I receive some allowance because my husband is a prisoner in the hands of the enemy. Because her husband left for Europe when war broke out in 1914, dumped her, was picked up by the Sûreté, spent the whole war banged up by the French, and then committed suicide, right? So, do you not see that my earnings, although they do support me, do not permit that I should go further in self-expression? So today, this is in the New York Times, I've presented my proofs and perhaps I may receive some aid to me. It is only for this that I would have it. After all, what is money? What she was asking for from the consulate was financial relief. And the document that she would have been issued, had she got one, she didn't, was called an Armutszeugnis. So to award somebody a certificate of impoverishment, which meant you could claim, this is in Germany, you would describe it as an Armutszeugnis Ausstellung, right? Which means to award somebody a certificate of impoverishment. So Armutszeugnis is a key word because Armut's in it, okay? I'm going to go through this. Now that word actually was published. Armut is poverty, poverty, amongst other things. Now the very same word was used in an editorial of the most important German English newspaper called the Deutsche Journal, the Hearst title, by someone called Posselt, who was the editor. And he published this that I've taken and found in a book by Peter Connolly Smith about popular culture in Germany, in America at the time. And Posselt is complaining that the German-American community is giving up their Germanness. Of course, they did, in the circumstances. So this is what Connolly Smith says about it. Says, despite, now, Posselt is addressing the issue of the Irving Theatre, which only showed German plays, okay? So this is Good Friday, which is possibly the day that Elsa could have sent the Urinal from Philadelphia, because it could have got there in 3 hours on the train, okay? Despite his appreciation for the American stage, however, Posselt was as prone to cultural nationalism in matters of German drama as Sanders, the previous editor, had been before him. As the 1916-17 season drew to an end, i.e. in April, for example, he voiced regular concerns, indeed growing resentment over the German-American public's ever-diminishing support of the Irving Theatre, the Irving Place Theatre. Recall in this context that Christians, who owned the theatre, wasn't sure whether he would be even able to open for the following season. Posselt's anger on the subject reached its climax in a long editorial titled The German Theatre in America and the War. It was unacceptable, he wrote, even now that the United States stood on the eve of war against Germany, that an institution such as the Irving Place Theatre, where German art has been cultivated and protected like a sacred flame, should face possible ruin because of the rabbit-heartedness of German-American theatre patrons too afraid to acknowledge their Germanness. This untenable situation, he insisted, was a poor account, ein Armutszeugnis. This untenable situation, Armutszeugnis, a cultural loyalty that would stand forevermore as a monument of shame for German America. Should Christiana, Find the means to reopen the next season, he wrote. It was every German's damn duty to patronise the theatre, and he meant every German, you, and you over there, who believe in German art, you who have always paid lip service to it when it required no courage to do so, you who have spent happy and enriching hours at the German theatre, and you who have money to waste on American show, all of you prove for once that you are Germans, German Americans in the deepest sense of the word. That could have been expressed by Elsa directly. So same day, Armutzeugnis appears in the news on that, and it's already in her vocabulary, okay? So what I've got here is a kind of, as you can see, this diagram, is a sort of semantic circuit that I believe that Elsa invested in the urinal by writing the name Armut on it, okay? Because that's what she does when she's making polemical gestures, okay? I will come back to what the choice of article was as I go through it. So we have this phrase, Armutzeugnis ausstellen. Armutzeugnis is a certificate of incompetence, a certificate of impoverishment, a glaring inadequacy, damning indictment, evidence of incapacity, certificate of poverty, and poor account. So Armut means destitution, paucity, deficiency, incompetence, dearth, scarcity, sterility, poorness, poverty, and barrenness, i.e. the barrenness of the baroness. So Armut is a pun, Armut, on the word Armut. So we have the phrase Armutzeugnis ausstellen or Armutzeugnis ausstellen. Yeah, we're at the bottom now. Yeah. So if you go to Zeugnis and go up, Zeugnis means witness, and that's the sense in which Martin Luther used it. Testimony, evidence, and object as evidence. And ausstellen, and this is wonderful, means betray, show, display, exhibit works of art, and install plumbing. So to install plumbing is to show works of art and vice versa. And I think Armutzeugnis ausstellen means to betray the incompetence of an exhibiting society that doesn't know that everyday objects can be works of art. Okay? Why then does she choose the urinal? Could be anything. Well, there is another phrase that I'll come to shortly that switches from a general blast to the independence to Duchamp in particular, who sits at the heart of it. So we've got the phrase Jemanden sich ausstellen, which means such things as to prove one's shortcomings, issue a certificate of indignation, to be poverty-stricken, to make someone blush with shame, extremely embarrassing, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, it's autobiographical. This is the Baroness. In a way, Armutzeugnis ausstellen can mean to display evidence of Armut, right? And so on. Because of that beautiful synonymity, you know, the phrase can mean these two different things. So ausstellen is the key. But the reason why I believe that she chose the urinal, and that therefore the target is Duchamp, is that there is a phrase, now of course Duchamp spoke German for a start, so he would have understood all that as a director of the society. And of course he was a native French speaker. And there is a phrase in French for to reprimand somebody, tear them off a strip, give them a slap in the face, piss all over them, which is envoyer pisser quelqu'un. There's your envoyer again. I think he used it in the letter subconsciously, because he knew she was slapping his face. Envoyer pisser quelqu'un, right, to send piss to somebody. But if you express it grammatically correctly, instead of, if you like, ejaculating it gutturally from the gutter, as that phrase, envoyer un pisser à quelqu'un means to send a urinal to somebody.
No way.
Okay, and I think that nails it.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. And on the right, you can see a painting she did, another response to rejection that was directed at Juna Barnes. And on the right, you can see another urinal. But it's not a Bedford urinal. It hasn't got an inlet, it hasn't got an outlet, it hasn't got tam-tam on the wall, no flushing rim, because it's a bedpan urinal, which is called a douche. And douche was the nickname of Duchamp's most intimate friends. And there's his pipe on it. So I think that what we're dealing with here is Elsa inscribing the urinal with a pun on armoured, that invests that discourse in it, so that when it arrives at the other end, the saying of the word galvanises and activates that discourse, and hopefully provokes them to exhibit it, because if they did, what would have happened was that the exhibiting society would have been closed immediately, right? You cannot even say urinal in certain circumstances. It would have caused killed off the society in its cradle, strangled by his own umbilical, closed the exhibition, and the people responsible, i.e. the directors, like Duchamp and his friends, would have been done for $1,000 fine and 12 months in the jail.
Wow.
Can we go to the next one then, please? Okay. So I think that is extraordinary. So on the point of, therefore, obscenity, which was actually mentioned in 6 different documents, that is evidence from the period, what you have on the right is one of them, which is the Blind Man Editorial, which was composed by Duchamp, Reyes, and Beatrice Wood, where it says, urinals are not offensive. You see them every day in the window, in the show windows of plumbers. Now, who wrote that knows nothing about it. I've looked at possibly 800 photographs of the show windows of plumbers in America, 5 years either side of 1917, and in not a single one will you see a urinal. Not one. Because the people who looked in plumbers' windows weren't looking for urinals. The plumbers got them from the plumbing supply house, okay? It's everyday people saying, oh, that's a nice washstand, I like that kind of thing, because it's local stuff. So what you see there is a round of that, and that's an advert from the Tin and Turn Company, actually in April 1917, which shows Mr. Joe Public standing outside a showroom of the Tin and Turn Company complaining that a bath is an obscenity, and these people have got no modesty. So this is an issue. On the bottom right is the cover of one of the issues of Sanitary Pottery, which was an in-house journal by the Trenton Potteries Company, which shows you what people do see in show windows, and there is not a urinal in any of them. So obscenity is a big issue. It was in Duchamp's letter. Apparently George Bellows objected to showing the urinal because it was obscene. Walter Pack, who was there, who was really behind the society, recalls in his own memoirs in 1938 that his objection was that the obscenity would mean that they would break the law. And then you have, it's in Blind Man 2, right? And McBride, Henry McBride, in his report says that this object was offensive. It was a hoax and being very bad taste. So obscenity is a big issue here. And there is nobody who knew the obscenity law from the sharp end, like Elsa did, because he was always running up against it. Can we have the next one then, please? So, to come back to that issue about why it was rejected, here is Van Gogh's membership card of the independence of France of 1884 from 1891. And it's just stressing the fact that if you weren't a member, you wouldn't be shown. So I don't know whether Elsa sent it in the hope that something might happen, whether she knew it would be rejected or not. But of course, if in fact it was understood that the independents had guaranteed that they would show anything that anybody sent in, then she might have thought that it would have got through, but it wouldn't have mattered if it didn't, because they also had got rid of a jury that said they weren't going to judge anything. So just by sending it and it arriving and then taking it out of the crate and saying no or yes, they were judging. So she forced them to judge. Okay? No, go to the next one then. Now Philadelphia comes into more focus. What you're looking at here are the logos of a plumbing supply house called Haynes, Jones and Cadbury. Okay? And you can see top and middle, there is the cartouche, which becomes after 1894, the standard logo that they use, and you can see it's an oval cartouche with the words Haynes, Jones and Cadbury in Philadelphia. There is a banderole that goes across that says "Her Joker" for Haynes, Jones and Cadbury, and you have an image of the Franklin monument that was on the town hall, but not until 1894. So you don't see this in Haynes, Jones and Cadbury's advertising before that. But what's interesting, and that actually, the statue was designed by Alexander Calder, who was Alexander Calder's grandfather. You know the Alexander Calder you know? Well, his grandfather designed that because he was Philadelphian Scottish ancestry there. It's wonderful, isn't it? So there you have two adverts with the standard advertisements that was used by Haynes, Jones and Cadbury. But they also had another logo, which you can see on the right, which is actually advertising. You know, it's in the catalogue of 1913. But what you're looking at is Elsa's God in a later version, okay? And it seems to me, and the two reports that stand, not reports, but the notices of the 5 notices that described on the 11th, the 14th, and the 25th, there were 5. 2 were informative, very informative, because they give the initials of mud as JC. Now, where does that come from? Here you have Cobbe and McBride saying Mutt's initials were JC, and they clearly have talked to each other, right? Well, I think that the JC is the JC of the Joker of Haynes, Jones and Cadbury, because a sort of a comic supply house would commission, order for their, you know, specifically for themselves, products such as Urinals from the Trent Pottery Company, who would put the Plumbing Supply House logo on. And there you see that diamond-shaped logo that I put on this urinal and photographed it as if it's being seen through the slats of the crate, and you can only see the J and the C. Now, what's interesting about this is, therefore, the urinal, therefore, seems to have come from Haynes, Jones and Cadbury, and that's why Cobbe could say it comes from a well-known manufacturer in Philadelphia and get it wrong, because they didn't manufacture urinals, but they manufactured all sorts of other stuff, and they manufactured the Ben Addis type of globe trap that turns into Gogh, which is now in the Philadelphia Museum. Okay?
Wow.
So I think that's where the JC comes from. And of course, it's also a bit of a jape, because you say, well, what's Jesus Christ got to do with it? But remember, at the time, one of the epithets for Jesus Christ was the fountain of eternal youth, the fountain of water. So fountain then all ties into that, doesn't it? Okay. Go to the next one then. Here are earlier examples of images of the anti-siphon globe trap that was made exclusively by Haynes, Jones and Cadbury, and I am saying was lying in the corner when Elsa went to the plumber to get the urinal. And therefore they're connected. That in a sense reinforces the rationale of why Elsa sent the urinal, because they both came from Haynes, Jones and Cadbury. Yeah, right. So here's an advert for Haynes, Jones and Cadbury on the top left, 1910, and you can see the kind of crate that the urinal would have gone in. Okay, this crate. They were shipped to the people buying them, some of the supply houses, because they had to be bought in bulk. They were bought in boxes of 12, but they would then split them up and sell them on to individuals, right? And there in the middle is the 1893 Haynes Jones and 1894 Haynes Jones Cadbury catalogue that shows the basic design of the Ben anti-siphon globe trap. There is the example on the left of that. On the right is therefore Elsa's card, and you can see how the centre of that is that, right? The Haynes Jones Cadbury would buy the guts, and then the plumber would add the drain pipe and so on afterwards. Okay, so this was brass. And the last image I can find of that in that form is the 1892 catalogue of McCambridge, who was clearly buying it to put under their posh sinks from Haynes Jones and Cadbury. So that's the last time it appears in that form in the catalogue, before it turns into that earlier form, that rather posh version, that then runs on to 1913. So this seems to me to kind of reinforce the view that this is how it happened, and therefore the urinal would have come from that company and so on. Okay? Now, there are two more pieces of evidence that I think confirms what I'm saying is my analysis. If you can go on to the next one, what you see here is an enlargement on the top left of the script on the actual label attached to the urinal. Now, what I'm saying is that Elsa sends the urinal to New York, and she actually sends it to that address, which is 110 88th Street. That's the address. She can't send it direct because she hasn't got a label. She doesn't really, she knows there's an exhibition, but she needs somebody on the ground to get it there. If she'd had a label, her address would have been on it and she would have sent it direct. But because that address is on it, it must have gone there because it went from there to the exhibition venue. And that is the address of someone called Louise Norton, who's involved, one of the team, all right? But she wasn't an artist, and she became very famous as a translator of French novels, Rimbaud and so on. And in 1921, she married Edgar Reyes, who was in New York in 1917, So she lived at that address. She was 27 in 1917. And people who are 27 in 1917 do not write in old-fashioned roundhand. What you see at the top there is the handwriting of Juliette Roche, who was married to Albert Glaise, who were living on the second floor of that address. The house was owned by Louise Norton, who had an article in Blind Man 2, right? She was living on the first floor. She was renting it to Albert Glaise and Roche, who were visiting, you know, and old friends, associates, not so friendly friends of Duchamp, part of the Cubist pit crew, you know, in Paris before this, right? First floor, nobody else is on the third floor, okay? But they are upstairs, and Albert Glaise is a member of the society and is exhibiting these two works. That's Roche's handwriting. On the right is Louise Norton's handwriting. That's actually from later. But the handwriting you learn as a child stays with you. And what you can see is personalised cursive handwriting that everybody used and was taught if they were born, say, in the late 80s and 90s in America, because there was a revolution in handwriting in the 1870s and 80s. Below that is Duchamp's handwriting, and that's the letter he wrote in April 1917, April 11. And in the middle is a section of Mina Loy's Feminist Manifesto. Mina Loy is part of this team too. She's a friend of Louise, she's a friend of Elsa's, they all met at the Arnsberg studio, da-di-da-di-da. So none of those people clearly wrote in what is, in fact, American roundhand. If you go to the next one, right? So that was a hand that came on the Mayflower. It's English roundhand. And people are still using it who were born in the middle of the century.
Jess, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So people like Duchamp and all the rest of them, born much later, were taught something else. So they didn't write in roundhand. It's an old hand written by an old person. And there you can see a sampler that you would copy as a child, say in the 50s and 60s. Yeah?
Who wrote that then?
Well, I'll tell you. Well, I'll tell you what I think. And on the right, you see an example from the Declaration of Independence, which is a classic roundhand M that you can see replicated on the label. So this is the label that's attached to the urinal at that address, is my argument. Where did it come from? Well, Mina Loy had only submitted one work, so she'd received two labels. Both Mina Loy and Roche and Norton would have been sympathetic to Elsa's agenda. And at the bottom, you can see an example from one of the great sources. I thought, where can I find lots of examples of American roundhand? And of course, it would be on envelopes addressed during the Civil War. Hundreds and hundreds of examples. So what I think happened was this. Louise Norton wrote a biography of Edgar Reyes that was published in 1972. And in it she describes life at the house she lived in that was owned by her mother at 110 West 88th Street, which is still standing, you can see it. All right, it's still there, it's a brownstone. And She was a girl about town. She was a new woman. She was enjoying herself, and she was out a lot. And she says that when she came back from her holidays in the autumn of 1917, she'd left on the 20th of May to go west for a holiday. She said that Mrs. Kiernan, her housekeeper, who didn't live in, you know where she lived, had said, "You'll never believe what went on in this house while you were away. With the Cumbria and Reyes and all that lot." She was a very respectable lady. She's described as a very respectable housekeeper, very proper, who did all the work. So I can see a situation where Elsa rings up Reyes, having got the urinal, and said, she would have asked, she said, "You are going to do this." That's what she did with people. She instructed people. She said, "You will be receiving a urinal. I want you to send it to da-da-da-da-da. Do it." And Louise would have said, "For fuck's sake, she might turn up. You know, I'll get on with it." So I think she would have said, because she is out a lot, to Mrs. Kiernan, who does everything, "Urinal's going to arrive sometime this week." It's not a word that Mrs. Kiernan wouldn't have used, right? "Can you do X?" And I think Louise could have easily have got a label, an official label for Mina. Said, "See that label on the mantelpiece? Fill it in, the address, and just fill the rest of it," without actually possibly telling them what to do. So what you see is the address plus the name Richard Mutt, plus the 5 final letters of the word fountain. So Richard comes with the label. It's not on the urinal. It's just unmarked, right? And you have there Richard Mutt and the word fountain. Richard, it's an R on the urinal. So Mrs. Kiernan's got to invent a name. Well, any old name, Richard. Which is what Duchamp says in 1967, interestingly. Because when he steals Elsa's urinal, he steals the discourse that's in it. Right? So I think there's a memory there. But where does fountain come from? I mean, fountain is not necessarily a bad title for a urinal. You've got to fill this bloody form in and get it out. Because at the time, the dictionary definition of a fountain was a jet of water that is caused to rise and fall, a receptacle with a reception thereof, an erection in a public place. Okay. But that is not, I think, the reason. If you go to the next slide, I think we are now introducing to the history of art somebody who's been completely neglected. No, you've gone too far. Can you go back? Further up than that, further up than that. That one. Okay? Now, Mrs. Kiernan grew up in, clearly, an Irish community. That's correct.
Jess, could you go on to the next
The
slide?
next one,
Please.
Jess.
Thank you.
Okay, these are 2 pages from English Gaelic dictionaries. Plenty of people in New York only spoke Gaelic at this time, Irish immigrants. They went through courts people didn't understand. Mrs. Kiernan lives on the Upper West Side in Irish Harlem. At the time, she's not living in, we know that. She is recorded in the census of 1900 as being born in 1848. So she's 67 in 1917. And she was taught Roundhead. She would have been taught Roundhead, but it's an old hand and it's an old script. So what comes through the door for a Gaelic speaker is a urinal that you can see in Gaelic is fuaran. And the core of that, the stem is fuar, meaning something wet. These are 2 dictionaries. The word for urinal is fuaran. Right? But fuaran means fountain. So I think Mrs. Kiernan obviously said, "Oh, it's a fuaran." That's what a fuaran. I mean, they're absolutely the same word, basically.
That's amazing.
So I think that's where fountain comes from.
Wow. It all links up, doesn't it?
It makes sense in this regime. So that's one point. The other point, go on to the
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So there's 2 more, very quickly. Well, this is
Next
the
slide, please, Jess.
Right, next slide. What you see here is Elsa's script. So what I'm saying is that the printing on the urinal is Elsa's. The handwriting on the label is Mrs. Kiernan's, which means it's not Duchamp on either. How do they explain that? No one talks about this. And I say, I'm certain that it's Elsa's printing. So what you've got on the right is an example, and you can see as you look through that there are the U's and the T's that you see on the Urinal in abundance, right? Now, the diagram on the left shows you the elevation, the bottom of the elevation of much Urinal, as in the photograph, and the bottom half is the plan view looking down. And the area, that's, the rectangular area on the face of the Urinal, which is occupied by the letters are marked, left out the numbers, is in fact on a curved surface. And you look down, so it's wider than it was. And of course, as from Stieglitz's point of view, you move from the centre, the inlet, to the tab on the left, the more the letters will distort. Go to the next one. So here are the easy ones. They're almost directly in front of Stieglitz. On the bottom, what you've got is the rectangle that the view of the Urinal is sitting in is actually the edge of the smallest crack you could fit it into. And what that shows is that when the R was painted, the shortest distance between the fingers holding the brush and the surface was 2 inches, because she's painting through the crack, perhaps. And it's the same at the other end when she's painting the T's, but in the middle it's 5 inches. Now you imagine, in the snow, coldest winter on record, outdoors, trying to paint letters, But nonetheless, here you see U's and T's taken from manuscripts in 2 big archives, the only 2 archives of Elsa's material. And you can see they are her U's and T's. They are absolutely unmistakable. They are made exactly the same way. They all vary, but they're all the same, okay? Nobody makes U's and T's like that. Go to the next one, right? We then have the N, okay? And you can see from the 2 poems on the left, bottom left, that she makes those sorts of ends.
Yeah.
What she doesn't do is the extension of what's called the hairline, which is the first stroke, below that. But if you look carefully, you can see that the hairline of the R and the leg of the R and the hairline of the M and the stem of the M, the final one, all finish in exactly the same place, except the first stroke of the M has run. And I think that ran because the brush was too fully charged. And the reservoir was there that possibly flowed down when it was en route from Philadelphia to New York. Okay, so there we have the N, and here you can see I've stretched it. I've stretched the actual insignia to compensate for the distortion. And you can see there that I've changed, if you look carefully, the oval-shaped dot after the R to the circle it would have originally been, which gives you the dimensions of the letter R that she actually painted on the surface of the R. Go to the next one. All right. I then found, as you know what you're looking at now, on the right-hand side, you've got the R as it's seen, the narrow one, on the Urinal, and it restored to its actual proportions. Below that, 3 more examples of that type of R with what I call a high waist, which has been then reduced in the next one, as it has been in the Stieglitz photograph, and there it is next to the one from the Stieglitz photograph. And I think that's
absolutely.
That's absolutely bad. There is no way it's anybody else.
Wow.
The end.
Amazing.
I'll leave the last one out.
Shall I put the next slide in?
Well, do you want me to talk about it very briefly? How long have we got?
Well, it's 1:45, so should we go to questions?
Let's do a question.
Yeah.
But just show it to me. There it is. It's really interesting. I'll just say one minute. Because I acquired one of these things, I could explore how Stieglitz constructed his photograph, or the ensemble that he photographed. So I've painted a copy of the painting that he used as a backdrop, which is Warriors by Marcin Haar, who was painted in Berlin. Specifically chose that to set the Urinal against. That is absolutely incredibly important. And I only discovered that by trying to understand what the thing would have looked like before Stieglitz took the photograph.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's lots to talk about that. What you see underneath that, as a consequence of trying to do that, I noticed, as you see, on the left, that's the Stieglitz photograph, but the top right-hand side is much darker than the top left-hand side.
Yeah.
So what I decided to do was convert that back into the original colour image. And you can see there in the middle that there is not that tonal imbalance. So when I reconverted that back to the black and white on the right, you can see that. So what's happened? Well, what's happened is not that the materials have deteriorated, it's because the emulsion on the plate and the paper that Sieglish used was called an orthochromatic emulsion, and it was not sensitive, consistently sensitive to the tonal values that come from the different wavelengths of coloured light that the emulsions respond to.
Wow. Awesome.
That's the kind of stuff.
Well, it's a fascinating. It's just absolutely mind blowing. It really is. You know, the amount of detail that we've uncovered is actually quite mind blowing. Do we have questions? And Jess, can we take the slideshow off now, and we'll go back to us? Hello.
Hello. Oh, they're still there. What a miracle.
Great. So, if you have a question, if you'd like to just come off, wave first, and then come off mute.
Have Karen and Chris given up?
I don't know.
No,
they're still here.
Are they still here? Are you still here?
Yeah.
I thought you'd have had enough.
No, we're here.
There we go.
Oh, no, go to bed.
I've got a question to start off.
Yeah, okay.
Why don't we know very much about Elsa? Why is it?
Well, we know a lot more now than we used to. She was well known in a literary sense because she actually published a lot of poetry in America in the Little Review between 1919 and 1921. So she was sort of celebrated then.
Yeah.
Okay. But she was very, very difficult. But she was never considered to be included in the ranks of the artists. And of course, she dies in 1927.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes to start attributing the Duchamp, she's well out of the way, isn't she?
Right.
Well, we don't know because she's been a very peripheral figure in the arts, hanging back under, if you like, but very difficult moving around, didn't leave any traces, very few traces, you see, did very little stuff. So she never had a home base, a stable base, never could actually settle into a regular lifestyle in a particular place. She was in the gutter most of her life.
Did she exhibit then? Because she obviously produced artworks.
No, she
and
didn't.
put
She
names
hardly
to
ever,
them.
I don't think she hardly ever exhibited anything.
And so, do we have a record of her previous works?
Well, what we have
You know, what do we know about?
is very useful biography by Irene Gamble from 2003. I would read that. And that actually tells us all we know, basically. Although she was being written about as women in Gogh and so on. Let's say 15 years ago. She starts to appear really 15 years ago. And of course, I found her because she was the only credible candidate. Not because I was looking for her. But she, in a sense, once you take Duchamp out of the centre of the frame, then Elsa on the periphery replaces him and he slips to the border. Okay?
Yeah.
He goes to the periphery. Because if you do, as I've just finished, a chronological account of what that Reyes did in that period of 2 years, you find that Duchamp comes in right at the end, really. He's involved with the Blind Man 2 thing, but it's only when you come to Roche's photographs, where you see that the Urinal is in the studio, that you know that Duchamp had got hold of it. It's still there, right? That's extremely interesting too, to find out what exactly was being there.
Yeah.
So he's not in the picture when you just say, let's trace the progress of who did what to it. But Elsa, just in a sense, was not written out. She was never written in until she has been retrieved, really, by people like this, and feminist art historians really did it from the 80s and 90s onwards. So I'm, in a sense, indebted to them, obviously. And they know greatly more about it than I do.
So the obvious question is, why isn't it more widely known now that we know all that and it's out there? So why is it still that we know Duchamp as the grandfather of modern art?
Because Turkey's don't vote for Christmas. What I mean is, the nexus of agencies that are called the art world have invested hugely all kinds of capital in the orthodox narrative at the centre of which sits Duchamp as the author, okay? And that can be cultural capital or reputational capital, and of course financial capital. Just imagine if it was accepted that Duchamp had not been the author of the Urinal. That would remove the authentication of the belief, because Duchamp apparently did it but didn't, that the work of art is what anybody chooses to say it is. How much if you like, contemporary art, will in a sense disappear if you took that away. So there's huge inertia and huge resistance. And I don't get published in prestigious places. I'm not on television because I'm saying there's a problem and nobody wants to know, do they? They just do. And you wouldn't, because if you have invested all that in the status quo, you're not interested in questioning the status quo. Your reputation, your power, you know, your celebrity, all the perks you get by being invited to talk again at another conference about what you think about fucking Duchamp, you know? Okay, so that's why. It's about the institutionalization of knowledge, of who is allowed to say what to whom about what, where and when.
That's fascinating. I think we could probably do another talk on that.
Because it's a cult. It's the cult, it's a cult.
There's a question here from one of our audience. So, if your assumptions are true, what does that make? If your assumptions are true about Elsa, what does that make the 14 urinal copies now in major institutions around the world produced by Duchamp?
Right, okay, shall I quickly say what I said to you earlier?
Yes,
all right.
please.
Well, the first full-size so-called replica, which is not a replica, and you only have to look at all of them together to know that they're not replicas. The first one appeared in 1950, and it was put on show in the Janus Gallery in New York on 57th Street. Sidney Janus had been involved with the Surrealists. He was a shirt manufacturer, kind of person you find in Duchamp world, right? His wife, Harry, was an art historian, never got the credit, right? They had a gallery on 57th Street, and they put on a show called Challenge and Deny in 1950. And they put on show in that, and it was actually contextualizing Duchamp at the time as it was as a surrealist. So they were painted by Magritte and Delvaux and Dali, and the urinal. And it was the urinal that the Januses had bought from the flea market in the north of Paris, that then Duchamp signed, and he is at that point claiming it. So this is a French urinal, made probably in the 1940s, that's got nothing to do with what's the original at all. Yet it is used, in a sense, to incestuously, retrospectautologically, if you like, authorise Duchamp's authorship of the original, which then authorises the replica.
Right.
That's tautology. So that's the first one. That is now in Philadelphia. In
2 minutes, about
1963, another one in Sweden, but in 1964, Duchamp authorised the production of a series of 8 plus 5 more. The reason he does that, and this is important, big gesture, he gets Arturo Schwartz, who's a crook, to get a Roman manufacturer to do this series, and the one in the tape is from that series. So that's 15, actually. What's interesting is he doesn't do that till 1964, because in 1963, Suzanne dies, and when Duchamp settles her estate, he doesn't find a letter from himself saying he ever did it, because that letter had gone to the box of her husband who died in 58 and was bequeathed to a niece and nephew in Ohio, and it only appears in 1980.
Wow, that's amazing. It's just a fascinating story. And at that point, I'm going to move seats again over to here.
But if folks want to send me, or you want to send me those questions, I will answer them.
Yeah, fascinating, absolutely amazing. I'm going to come back in here and just because it's I'm just about 5 to 10. What are people's reactions to that? Is that you can come off mute if you like, and just for a minute or two, and give me your feedback. Or yeah, how's that been? Do you have any more questions? Has it been insightful? Did you learn something? Everyone's really quiet. Go, Heather.
I think it's amazing, all the detail and information that we've been presented with tonight, and I think it's there's just a lot of deception in the whole thing, isn't there? It's like here we all are believing that Duchamp is the grandfather of modern art, and you know, Tracy Emin and everybody else that's followed in his footsteps, and yet it's all been a sham. So I think that's really, well, I'm guessing it's all been a sham. We can all assume now that that's all been a sham. So yeah, very interesting.
Brilliant. I think for me, it's going to be interesting to see now what the picture is and how things emerge, because obviously it's going to have to get more of a wider audience, isn't it, really, being such a big thing. So, yeah. At this point, thank you so much, Glyn. It's just been absolutely mind-boggling, and I think I need a glass of wine now to unwind all that information.
Can I just say one more thing as a summary? I was just saying that parodying Immanuel Kant, for those who think that urinals were made according to aesthetic criteria, which they weren't, when he died for a piss, the urinal is the most beautiful object in the world.
And on that note, I'm going to say thank you to Glyn, and thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you to Jess for being techie, and thank you for Blue Jam for pinching their Zoom account. Brilliant. We are at the studio in Morland, and it's brilliant to see you all. If you'd like to feedback, send me an email afterwards. That would be absolutely wonderful. I'd really appreciate it. Okay.